Hello there, this is Sohail Hasni, your host at Energypreneurs. Cheap solar power, batteries, and electric vehicles are changing the transport and energy sector as we know. I bring in guests to this podcast who will help you with their ideas to navigate this energy transition. Thank you for joining. Hi, Michael. Good morning from Sydney. I know you're a podcaster and a futurist. Amazing combination. Maybe you introduce yourself first. I don't think I can do any justice.
Sure, we're discussing in the green room. I'm a podcaster like you're a podcaster. We just like having great conversations and it gives us an excuse. So yeah, I'm Michael Barnard. I last year had to accept the term climate futurist because people kept applying it to me. I always thought it was pretentious. And in Australia, pretension doesn't go very far. So I hope this doesn't bounce off them. I considered that way because I do projections of scenarios of major areas of climate problems, decarbonization, and the solution set through 2100, decade by decade. And I don't claim to be right. I just claim to be less wrong than most. And that's starting to turn out quite nicely. Thank you very much. I've got ones for hydrogen, maritime shipping, aviation, steel, cement, grid storage, vehicle to grid. I think I'm missing one or two. Point is, I've got a perspective about where the world is going. Now, I formed that perspective in a really simple way by being a broad spectrum nerd who knows business and a bit of cognitive science. My background includes working on up to billion-dollar technical transformation projects around the world for one of the world's biggest firms. Billion-dollar plus price tags don't make me think those are big numbers. They just make me think they're numbers. And I know how to read a balance sheet and I know how to figure out what's going to be technical, economically viable. But I've also got enough of a STEM background that I go back to the basics of technology and engineering. Will a proposed solution work? Will it cost out to be economically competitive? Will it work at all? And third, will people accept it? That's the cognitive side. And that informs all my analyses, helping investment funds and doing investment portfolio assessments, helping venture capitalists with their clean tech investment theses, helping with certain classes of due diligence for a certain investor. I get to do that kind of stuff. It's a lot of fun. I'm helping move the needle as we move forward. And it's rewarding personally, intellectually, and emotionally. Oh, and also financially.
Amazing. Because where the world is very much focused is what's happened today, someone taking a sort of macro level, long-term view, that is missing. Then I like the bit that you mentioned, cognitive science and STEM. I thought that's commodities.
I know several people who've got that mix, but I might just know weird people. I spent a reasonable amount of time with John Cook. He's a PhD of cognitive science. You might know him as the person behind the skepticalscience.org or .com, which collects all the disinformation from climate deniers and then lays out why it's disinformation, debunks each one. He's also moved on to Cranky Uncle versus Climate Change. He's a PhD cognitive scientist. He's also a cartoonist. So he developed a bunch of cartoons into a book-length. Best way I'd put it, it's an inoculation against climate disinformation. Then COVID hit, and of course, he pivoted to debunking and breaking down COVID disinformation. But he and his PhD advisor, Stefan Lewandowski, I met Stefan when I was dealing with wind energy disinformation in Australia in 2010, 2012, something like that. And of course, I ended up knowing several people who got to work with Daniel Kahneman, the author of Thinking Fast and Slow. Mm-hmm. And despite being a psychologist, winner of a Nobel Prize for economics, I didn't get that opportunity, but I get to know people who know him. So 1 degree of separation.
Yeah, that principle of 1 or 2 degrees of separation through LinkedIn and others. It's amazing world that we need. I like the way that you are doing. So you're saying hydrogen, green ammonia, steel, V2G, and among many other topics. So you have a very clear vision where things are going to be because with your skill and the knowledge, you thought it through. lack of a better word, right? Because most people haven't had the time to think it through. I thought hydrogen, that's a no-brainer. I don't know why people still keep on pushing hydrogen cars. Anyway, I'd like to hear your quick summary on that one. What's your view?
Sure. It's actually interesting. So one of the things I end up reading is the sociology and anthropology of science, Kuhn's structure of scientific revolutions, where paradigm shift comes from, or Popper's work on falsification, or Bruno Latour, in this case, his work on why some technologies succeed and why some other technologies, which are equal or better, fail. An example for people of a certain age is Betamax versus VHS. Betamax was arguably a superior product, but VHS won. And so why becomes the question. And what Latour talks about is that you end up with a narrative that a whole bunch of actors support. They, what he calls enrolling in. And then the assumptions at the center of the narrative, hydrogen for energy is going to be cheap being one of them, becomes a black box that is never questioned. And so a whole bunch of things occur to create a network of human and non-human actors and a narrative that is self-healing and resistant, even if it's based on complete falsehoods. And in the 2015 to 2020, there's a preceding narrative around hydrogen is that it was green, it was clean. It's a kind of a greenhouse gas. It prevents methane from degrading in the atmosphere. So it's 37 times worse than CO2 on 20 years. Oops. And it leaks, of course, being tiny. But the narrative of it being clean, the narrative that it was going to be a significant part of our energy future has been coming in and out of fashion for decades. In 2015, it started up again. And at that point, major organizations like CSIRO in Australia, the IEA, LUT, European University, which has research programs in space, the JRC, the Joint Research Council of the EU, Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact, which is Germany's equivalent of the JRC, were all publishing projections of the cost of green hydrogen in 2030 and 2050. And they were 3 to 4 times off the reality. Oil and gas companies came in because without hydrogen, their hydrocarbons wouldn't be worth anything. They wouldn't have a business model. They don't sell electrons. All the countries that have major fossil fuel GDP portions were very willing to hear the story that hydrogen for energy was going to preserve their royalties. Australia bought into that big time. Their hydrogen strategy, which I read and analyzed a few years ago, Australia exports 4 times as much energy as it uses domestically. And their theory was they're going to actually increase that. It was going to be green hydrogen and green ammonia as the energy carrier.
Yes. Yeah. Story sells.
The gravy train keeps going. They'll just replace one molecule with another. A lot of people bought in. Engine manufacturers love hydrogen because it's a molecule. They get that. The industrial heating people bought in because, I just have to replace one gas with another gas. Easy story. And it's wrong, unfortunately. But that self-healing narrative around the black box is falling apart in the past couple of years because deals aren't reaching final investment decision. When they look inside the black box and count up all the costs, what they find is that it's expensive. I was outside the narrative doing my own assessments on proposals and deals in Africa, Australia, North America, Europe, and Canada, and saying, here's what my basic cost benefit analysis says the cost is going to be at that point. And here's how much it's going to cost to distribute the hydrogen by pipeline or by ship. And it never came anywhere near what the narrative said. So I had a choice. I could either believe the narrative or I could believe basic math and basic science. I chose to believe basic math and science. And my hydrogen projection through 2100 is heterodox. Unlike everybody else's projection for hydrogen demand, in my world, hydrogen demand is going to go down over the coming decades. And the reasons for that are pretty obvious. 40% of hydrogen demand is for refining oil. And we're going to be refining a lot less oil in the future if we're actually going to solve climate change. The oil that needs the most hydrogen is from Alberta, Mexico, and Venezuela. Heavy, high sulfur crude oils. As oil demand decreases, what people are going to be looking for is the cheapest oil, and that's going to be the stuff that's closest to water, lightest, and least sulfur. So the hydrogen demand for refining is going to be hit by a double whammy. Now, they get a lot of that by offtake from other refining processes. So they manufacture a lot of it accidentally out of the refining process, out of fossil fuels. So that's good though, because it's still high emissions. Hydrogen today is a global warming problem on the scale of aviation. We got to fix it. Ammonia is 25% of demand. It's the next biggest one. That's used for fertilizer and mining explosives. And I have a whole bunch of levers that tell me if ammonia gets more expensive, we're going to find ways to replace it in a lot of cases. Precision agriculture, including drone spraying that reduces soil compression. We're going to be seeing agri-genetics like pivot bios, microbes that fix nitrogen at the roots of plants. There's a few levers in there that would enable us to have a reduced hydrogen for fertilizer requirement. Another Australian reference has got to molten oxide electrolysis working in research, as does Boston Metals. Not commercialized yet, but it's starting to look like it might pencil out to be cheaper than green hydrogen for steel. So we've got a bump for green hydrogen for steel. My steel projection is actually somewhat heterodox as well, because it leans heavily into electric arc furnaces and scrapping. Part of the reason is China's infrastructure boom is pretty much over. They've built hundreds of cities, dozens of ports, 177,000 kilometers of roads, 47,000 kilometers of high-speed rail. They've done all that. So now they've got 260 to 280 million tons of domestic scrap every year, and they're pivoting to electric arc furnaces. And so much more electric arc furnace based on scrap. Then we've got direct reduction of iron with biomethanol or biomethane, because we already do direct reduction with natural gas as a feedstock, turning into syngas and then doing the reactions there. We can do that with biological sources of methane as well. So that's, once again, a reduction of the total amount required that hydrogen necessarily provides. That's an increase, but not nearly as much. All ground transportation will electrify. All inland shipping and most short sea shipping is just going to electrify with batteries as well. Crossing oceans, the first couple of hundred nautical miles on either end will be under battery power. All port motive movement will be battery power. And that's simply because then there will be air pollution near human beings, and that's going to be cheaper than the actual motive power for other stuff, which is biofuels. I just did the math again, because the International Monetary Organization actually found a spine. Even after the United States walked out in a huff, they voted last week for binding emissions regulations for all maritime shipping. Net zero by 2050. It's imperfect, but serious numbers. If you're above the bottom range for emissions, there's a gap. You get some for free and it declines, but you have to pay $100 a ton, which is higher than the EU's price for the stuff that you emit above that. And then $380 a ton for the stuff that's out there. And all that money gets taxed against an operator's fleet and reinvested in maritime decarbonization.
Yeah, that can create a huge boom for energy efficiency, because they can, of course, buy the rights to pollute that may be cheaper immediately rather than paying $200 a ton.
Yep. It is tagged against 2008 when slow steaming wasn't around. The opportunities for efficiencies have increased. But for maritime shipping, for crossing the Pacific, for me, it's biofuels. I don't see synthetic fuels manufactured with hydrogen in there. And similar story for aviation. We're going to be seeing hybridized battery electric turboprops for 1,000-kilometer routes with 100 people. That's viable. 95% of flight energy will be from batteries, but the biofuels mostly reserved for divert and reserve. And so what you end up with is only the longest flights and shipping require liquid fuels, and those will be biofuels. The volumes of liquid fuels aren't nearly as high. 40% of maritime shipping tonnage is fossil fuels today. And like the refinery story, we're not shipping nearly as many of them. We're going to be shipping a lot fewer.
You're shipping a lot of oil around.
The other 15% is raw iron ore, and mostly going to China. China is, up until last year, was manufacturing 10 times the steel of the next biggest country, India, and half of all the steel on the planet every year. Now it's diminishing its volumes quite substantially. It's diminishing its new steel requirements quite substantially. So those ships of raw iron ore aren't steaming in nearly the same tonnage. So that's 55% of the tonnage of maritime shipping that's in structural decline this year. We won't need nearly as much maritime shipping fuel as we think we do. When I said about time for the IMO, it was only in 2021 that they started doing well to wake measurements of fuel and emission. Before that, it was just tank to wake. And I was like, what are you doing? Methanol drove a big tanker through that hole for a decade, getting everybody convinced methanol was the new shipping fuel because its tank wake emissions were non-existent. And so now that the IMO's got these harder targets, there's going to be a lot of movement. It's going to be interesting to watch. So that's why I'm bearish on increases in hydrogen demand is going to go down. Michael Lieberg and I were talking, he's got famously the hydrogen ladder, which is a great tool, but he admitted that he'd bought that hydrogen would be cheaper than it's turned out to be. So his hydrogen ladder, I've been telling him for years that most of the stuff on there is going to fall to the bottom rung, the rung of doom, over time. Every time he puts it out, the rung of doom gets thicker and thicker. And soon it's going to be 80, 90% rung of doom, 10, 20% actual use cases for hydrogen. The narrative is starting to fall apart. BP and Shell have left hydrogen for transportation. BP fired its team focused on that. Norway's 2020 industrial policy was hydrogen for energy everywhere. Its 2024 policy was, well, maybe over here. But here's what we're doing now for our industrial policy. The leading economic advisory groups in France and Germany just released advisory paper to their governments and hence the EU, because those are the two largest economies in Europe, saying, ignore hydrogen for trucks. It's dead. It's battery electric trucks. And that's what you need to focus on. Open up the regulation, get rid of the hydrogen refueling stations every 150 kilometers. Megawatt charging systems are what's going to be the winner on this. We don't see a pathway to economic viability for hydrogen for road transportation in any category. And so they're taken very seriously. But this is the Latourian narrative falling apart. Now, in Latourian actor network theory, it's called disarticulation, when actors start removing themselves from the dominant narrative. And so that's where we are right now. The narrative was self-healing for a decade. Now it's collapsing. People are abandoning it. And the people left inside the narrative are getting increasingly angry and upset.
Absolutely. And I think the other part that I got always intrigued that solar is going down, and they keep on saying solar will be so cheap, hydrogen will be free almost. But if solar becomes quarter cents a kilowatt hour, we are living in a very different world. The whole utilities are going to collapse, vehicle to grid. So many things will happen before people think, oh, I can make a hydrogen and put into the house to burn gas. Those people just take it. Solar will be so cheap, the hydrogen will be $2 a kilo. But if solar is that cheap, the world is different already.
One thing I felt like publishing recently, there's been a lot of negative news. I feel like it's coming out of Florida, specifically, White House South. And so I felt like writing a good news story. And I'd heard a lot about what Pakistan had done over the past few years. I did the research and I figured out they've now got 22 gigawatts of solar, almost entirely on rooftops. There was very low regulation in the space. There was a glut of solar panels and batteries. The grid was unreliable in most of Pakistan, and the electricity costs were high. And there was a bunch of places where net metering existed. The government basically didn't do much of anything. It's just business people said, I need electricity. Solar panels are cheap. And everybody slapped solar panels on every flat surface they could find. And now the country is one of the leading countries for rooftop solar globally. And wait a minute, how can Pakistan be a leading company for solar? It's just not the narrative we think of. One of the authors and thinkers I give a lot of credence to is Kishore Mahbubani. Mahbubani is a Singaporean. He was their leading diplomat for decades. He was PM Lee's right-hand diplomat. Just as Nixon had Kissinger, PM Lee had Mabubad, basically. And so he was constantly dealing with China, the United States. He was their UN representative for a long time. And about a decade ago, he published a book called Has China Won? Which was a very good book, and I strongly recommend it. The past decade of Xi Jinping has changed some of the stuff. China and America, neither of them have fully listened to his guidance, but the United States has done worse. But he also wrote a book in 2019 called Has the West Lost It? A Provocation. And he pointed out that the West is completely ignorant of how peaceful and well-governed the rest of the world is becoming. The West doesn't realize how much the rest of the world has improved in terms of governance and working towards prosperity for their populace, the rule of law, a lack of wars. In Asia, there hasn't been a war for decades. Asia looks at the United States with its 30 years of invasions and goes, what is wrong with that country? Meanwhile, they're not having wars with their neighbors. They're dragged into Russian and American wars, Pakistan especially, because Afghanistan is right across the border. But even Afghanistan has managed 3 peaceful transitions of power in the democracy. They're backsliding a bit right now, but they are much better governed than they used to be. They're no longer a dictatorship. Asia is collaborating with neighbors, having peaceful relationships, trading and talking, and bringing citizens out of poverty. We in the West tend to have a lot of Western chauvinism as I look at what's happening on the ground versus perceptions. Pakistan was really a case in point. At 22 gigawatts of solar, that's 5 times more than Canada. We have the second biggest country in the world, enormous landmass. We could put 22 gigawatts of solar in our smallest province. But we haven't. It's a fascinatingly dynamic world. Things have changed. Like Gerard Reed, one of my collaborators in the Redefining Energy podcast group, called it a revolution. Cheap manufactured batteries, solar panels. It's not an evolution, it's a revolution. I recommend people find that episode where he's talking about that because it's well worth listening to.
Absolutely, because I remember writing a blog many years ago that the technologies that we have with the batteries and solar power, the utilities should be worried, especially from residential customers, because average consumption of a residential customer, especially in Asia, is so low. You don't need the utilities. And they are so inefficient, so badly run. You can just bypass, possibly. I'll look up the numbers. That's what happened in Pakistan as well. If your consumption is 2-3 kilowatt hour a day, and you can put 2-3 kilowatt on rooftop and you get 3-4 hours a day, it's a very simple math. And if you can put a battery, you get nighttime covered.
The thing is, though, all of these countries are increasing in affluence, and that means increasing in vehicles and air conditioning and hot water demand. Energy demand is going up quite rapidly in many of these countries. Now, in many of them, they're once again leapfrogging and going to electric 2-wheelers. Pakistan, they have 2 or 3 major firms importing kits from China and assembling 2-wheelers and branding and marketing and distributing them, which is a very reasonable business thing. BYD and another Chinese car manufacturer are establishing factories in Pakistan to build electric cars for Pakistani people.
That changes the whole dynamics if BYD comes in, because the Pakistan has a lot of those little Suzuki Alto, because I thought there was a huge market of converting them to electric. They're everywhere.
That's what happened in India. I spent a lot of time dealing with India last year. India Smart Grid Forum asked me to do a seminar series. So I was on the phone with Indian electrical utility professionals 13 times over the course of the year. The ISGF in the 2015 or so did a study and said, what we should do is make sure that 2 and 3-wheelers are sold without batteries, and that we have a policy which supports battery swapping for that vehicle mode. And so that means the basic scooter is affordable because you don't have the capex of the battery. You're buying the battery with the electricity as a service. They've converted to a model that people can afford. And now they've got massive numbers of electric two and three wheelers. One of the big success stories out of Asia, BNF reported a year ago, said, here's categories of electrification of transportation, but the one that's removing the most is two and three wheelers in the developing world. That's where barrels of oil are being avoided.
Yes, I did a project in the Philippines as Asian Development Bank staff. We put together $500 million to convert 100,000 tricycles to electric. There was a lot of politics and it didn't go ahead, and I was ahead of time. It was 2011, just where Tesla Model S and Nissan Leaf came out. As battery prices come down, it will become affordable. People say batteries $1,000 a kilowatt hour. Doesn't make sense. But now it is $80, even $50. Battery swap is a very smart thing. We are helping a company in Bangladesh, Tiger New Electric. They are targeting the 4 million tricycles that are in Bangladesh operating with lead acid batteries. How can you take lead acid, give them a lithium and battery as a service? I have a question around that. You also thought through the V2G aspect, because I think this battery as a service can expand a bit. So I take a battery, run around with my car, and end of the day, I swap my battery and take one extra, go home and plug it in, and then my house is lit up. So I may be living in a small place, don't have access to a rooftop, but I get a fully charged battery. So I think that's where it's not quite V2G, of course, but I can connect my tricycle to the house or put a spare battery. Have you had any time thinking in that space?
Yeah. So I've looked at battery swapping globally, and I've got my projection through 2060 vehicle to grid related technologies. That's two different conversations. I'll start with battery swapping. I've identified the conditions for success that I think are required. A, governmental policies that's supportive of battery swapping. It's not for everything. It's not for personal cars. In general, it has to be very high volumes of small things like scooters, because it has a strong value proposition for reducing the cost of acquisition and enabling charging in places where there's poor infrastructure. That's a great developing world thing. And it's not going to work well in the developed world. It works really well in the developing world. Different model. Many fewer scooters of that type here. Many fewer two and three wheelers here. But there is a big category, which is fleet vehicles with a geographically prescribed range, high duty cycles, typically urban. Cement trucks, they go back and forth to the cement mixing plant and the job site multiple times a day. They're carrying heavy loads. That's a place where the central depot that everything returns to is an obvious place to put a battery swap facility and to run the big wire into, because the trucks always go back there. Garbage trucks are another one, but you have to think fleet and vehicle homogeneity. People talk about doing this as the solution for road freight, but road freight is up 1,000 manufacturers. There's no standard, and it's multiple different sizes, from the three-wheel tuk-tuks and what do they call them? The three-wheeled small trucks of India, up to small cargo utility vehicles, up to sprinter van scale, up to cube van scale, up to flat-sided large trucks, but they were integrated to semi-trailers, to Australia's road trains. That's a lot of different scales for battery swapping and multiple vendors in each of those. The only thing that is required in those cases, they're going to be looking at total cost of ownership. And now when we can do megawatt scale charging and batteries are dirt cheap, is it cheaper just to buy trucks with batteries in them now? The price difference is going down. A lot of the impetus for swapping was batteries were expensive. The other option, charging was slow. Now charging isn't necessarily slow. And one of the ways getting around the thin pipe going into a facility to enable slower charging of batteries is where you put a big honking battery in a container on the site to buffer the electricity. And it charges from the grid 80% of the time and gives high-speed charging to the vehicles when they come in. That's a model that I think is going to work well for trucking in the United States. Lots of solar, buffering batteries, slow to increase grid connections that can increase over time. So the West is going to be probably doing microgrids with buffering batteries and solar. but different places will solve in different ways.
Yeah, I like the conclusion that you quickly made the beginning that Neo tried battery swap. It's a bit difficult. But for the small vehicles globally, all the delivery bicycles or motorcycles you see all over Asia and the tuk-tuks, of course, that's a real good target. And not only just because price, I think also the technology credibility is becoming an issue. You may have bought a battery, but not all batteries are the same. So if you're swapping, you're not taking the risk because you just got it to charge. If this doesn't work, hopefully you get a better one or you decide something else, but you are not wedded to that expensive piece of technology, another black box that you don't know nothing about.
I'll just say that 2 and 3-wheel vehicles have the worst engines for efficiency and pollution. They are horrifically inefficient compared to modern cars, and they stink more than make people sick. Lawnmowers in North America are equivalent. The societal benefits of electrifying that fleet as much as possible and as rapidly, everybody gets healthier. The air gets cleaner. Emissions plummet. It's a win.
And the noise factor as well. Other area that I don't know whether you had time to think through is similarly the two-stroke engines, single-stroke engine that runs this lot of boats all over Asia. Because again, battery on wheels or battery on water is the same thing. You're just trying to run a motor. What's your vision on this electric boat area?
As I said earlier, from my perspective, all inland shipping and most short sea shipping and boating is going to just go electric. If you want to go from Singapore to take the 45-minute ferry to Indonesia, then that'll be electric. Most recently, I was speaking with somebody whose firm had put the battery hybrid system in 2 massive ferries across the English Channel between France and Britain every day, multiple times a day. And that's almost entirely batteries. British Columbia just put in battery electric hybrids as well. And it's going to go fully battery electric as soon as they can get charging at the docks. So now we're seeing massive stuff. There was a great study out of Berkeley Lab in the United States in 2022. Sadly, I could never get the lead author to pay attention to me so I could speak to him about it. Basically, they said at these battery prices, with today's energy density, it's cost, not volume or mass, that is the break-even point. If batteries are $100 per kilowatt hour for storage, then 1,500 kilometer routes pencil out as economically viable with no subsidies. And if they're $50 per kilowatt hour, 3,000 kilometer routes pencil out. Guess what? When I was speaking to Denaline's technical maritime staff and their design organization in Glasgow a couple of years, I asked them, here's the trend for battery energy density, and here's what it means for how far you can go. And I just went through some basic math and said, that's 1,200 nautical miles. Are any scheduled routes 1,200 nautical miles? No. They're stunned. Our biggest ships can run on batteries? My big thing is that statement about 55% of shipping tonnage is in structural decline. That's for bulks. Containers are going to increase. The thing about a container is, right now, a lot of containers being shipped are full of batteries. And you can put a container full of charged batteries into a ship and plug it in just the way you do a reefer container. And at the terminal, you can hoist it out and drop it on the terminal exactly in the same place you drop the reefer terminals, refrigerated containers, and plug it in. There's already the people, processes, everything for that. Minor changes provide electrical power for container ships. On the Yangtze in China, there's already 700 unit container ships traveling 1,000-kilometer routes with containerized batteries.
Wow, I was not aware of that. That's mind-boggling because if you already have containers and their batteries, we just have to fuel the mothership and you get a free ride, right?
Yeah. So you can see a ship full of containerized battery energy storage systems steaming from China to this pit Rotterdam. And they're going to deliver the batteries, but they load them fully charged and use the energy in the batteries to get them to Rotterdam.
My God, I was initially thinking they have this floating small barge which you tow in the back, and it's almost like a battery swap. You pick up another fully charged one that you are dragging with you, and that fuels the ship. But you are saying it's even better because I'm actually delivering batteries. That's quite something.
I will say that this is obvious to me and to a lot of other people too. I'm not claiming that I'm uniquely seeing this vision. Other people are making it work. I've spoken to several of them. The world of transportation is changing radically.
I also wanted to get your views on the V2G side of it, because Australia, we have more than 1.5 kilowatt per capita now rooftop solar. A lot of solar getting wasted because the grid don't take it. So it's a zero marginal cost. It's almost a zero cost. I have a house, I'm getting negative electricity bills, so utility pays me regularly because I have a battery as well, which is fantastic. Now, as government planning to do, one of the election promises, multi-billion-dollar subsidy for home batteries. So everybody will have it eventually as the batteries are becoming cheap. It will be cheaper than a fridge to put a 20 kilowatt battery at home, right? So everyone has a fridge. Why can't you have another white goods? Once you have that, what happens to the power distribution companies? And then, of course, everyone has electric car, which will have ultimately 100 kilowatt hour battery, very easy, right? And my daily consumption is 15 to 20 kilowatt hour. What happens to the power companies?
So 3 or 4 things. One is cognitive science. I'll start with the availability bias. Says anything you can think of rapidly is what you think is common. Australia has a higher penetration of rooftop solar than any other Western country. And it has a higher penetration of home batteries than any other Western country. Its policies have been positive for that, but also because Australia is more sprawling than the United States. It has a higher number of square meters of floor space per person, living space, even than the United States.
Yeah, if you count all of Australia.
Yeah, this is just residences. Okay. Residences are big and they're single story. They've got huge roofs and it's lots of sunshine and very little cloud cover most of the year. That's why white Australians always look sunburned. It's a sunburned country. And so it's relatively unique globally. It's not a universal solution. I have a different availability bias. I look out my windows. I've spoken to Mark Jacobson and people about this. I'm going to say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 19-story residential condo buildings on the block I'm living in that I can see from my window that looks out over the courtyard. I have potentially 3,000 people living on this block. And that's much more common as an Asian style living. The population density, even if the form factor is different in Europe. Paris and Copenhagen's 5, 6-story walk-ups are very dense. They're just differently built. They were built pre-elevators. They would look different if they were built after elevators were invented. That multi-unit residential thing puts a real crimp on the expansion of vehicle to grid. I was starting council president, kind of like the mayor of my vertical village here, and I got heat pumps approved for putting in buildings. So we didn't need heat pumps. We didn't need air conditioning historically. Now we do. You might have heard the climate is changing. Electric car charging put in downstairs. And so I was looking at the vehicle to grid story from that perspective. The stalls and the electricity for where the cars park in multi-unit residential buildings are not behind the same meter as the condos.
Okay.
They're behind the commercial entity that owns the building's meter. And so the commercial entity that owns the building is providing a pass-through cost for the electricity and charging. But the condo corporation as the electric bill with the utility. No personal value proposition for a car owner if they live in multi-unit residential buildings. They can't do vehicle to home because you can't run an extension cord up 4 stories. What is in the equation is smart metering, demand management, and that will happen automatically. So all these commercial places where there's electric vehicle charging, they all have peak kilowatt hour draw requirements. In my building, a quarter of our electricity bill for the corporation is from going over our peak power allotment. We pay $5.65 per kilowatt of power above our peak. Smart charging will balance building energy demand to keep it below that peak, including electric vehicle charging. Smart chargers will distribute the electric car charging over the night. And so That will provide for multi-unit residential buildings automatic demand management away from peak. The building is paying the electricity charges at peak rates and paying the overage. So they're heavily fiscally incented to reduce demand in peak and smooth their demand over time. So that's going to happen automatically. 90% of people in Asia live in residential buildings. A whole bunch of people don't qualify for vehicle to grid from cars. And something else is going to occur there, which is highly beneficial for utilities, which is that smoothing demand away from peak, because they can put a fiscal signal in there if they haven't already, and the corporations will hear that fiscal signal, and a market, and everywhere that this occurs, markets will emerge, technologies will emerge to deal with this. Next one is aggregated demand management. I'll go with ChargePoint. It's the biggest in North America. They can aggregate 5,000 cars in a city that are charged in and have a relationship and a technical connection to the electricity management system in the utility. They can sign a contract saying, I will turn down the charging to 5,000 cars when you ask me to. So that isn't a vehicle to grid. That's a demand management aggregation. So it's two demand management aggregations that come along before we get to vehicle to grid or vehicle to home. So vehicle to home and vehicle to grid are detached home opportunities. They're not personal, not multi-unit residential opportunities. Then we get into cognitive science of vehicle to grid. I mentioned Kahneman earlier. Kahneman won his Nobel Prize for something called prospect theory. Prospect theory is one of the fundamental tenets of behavioral economics. Prospect theory says what we know instinctively, but economics pretends we're Homo economicus. We're 100% rational, unemotional beings who have access to all the information in the universe, basically Spock from Star Trek, except in mating season every 7 years. In reality, because we were born in the savannah and terrified of being eaten by lions, we fear potential loss more than we value potential gain. So if I say, you have the opportunity to win $100 or lose $100, the average person, unless they're a poker player, I know how this works. I trained it out of me, as day traders have trained themselves out of it. And corporations use spreadsheets to avoid this, but human beings say, that's not a good bet. I could lose $100. That's where their mind goes. You actually have to say, you might lose $100 or you might gain $200 before the psychological reaction balances out. For vehicle grid for people in detached homes, the way this plays out is I have ownership of the range in my car and the kilowatts in my car. I fear losing that. I value what I have probably more than you're willing to pay me. You can't get around this. There's a terrible book with some good insights called Nudge from the early 2000s. I say terrible because it leaned into libertarian paternalism, which is just a horrible term. They were libertarians, so they thought everybody liked libertarianism, as opposed to thought it was Ayn Rand weirdos and objectivists. And so their point, though, was that you can design things that the behavioral economics tell us you can design systems so people are likely to choose to participate in them. If you're a utility and you have, for example, special rates for an electric car, when you get the electric car bundle, you were automatically opted into vehicle to grid with certain agreements. Psychologically, if you're asked, do you want to do vehicle to grid, and prospect theory kicks in and you say no. There's ways to design it for the 10% who live in detached homes and the 3% who have electric cars on the grid. But I'm not fussed about vehicle to grid because it's going to be a rounding error compared just because of all the other things I've told you about.
I have to think it through, because I was thinking a view of the world where cars are parked wherever and they can charge and discharge through induction charging or connection. So in that scenario, whether the car is parked in the detached house or an apartment, there will be grids available to charge. So there may be an alternative built in, especially for new design places. People will also like to take that electricity out. If solar is everywhere, electricity becoming a free resource, people will find a way to trade it and take the imbalances, because the demand management type of thing that you mentioned, we had it in Australia, demand bidding for almost 30 years, right? When the first
Mhm.
Victorian pool rule was established, people did not do much demand bidding, except one company when the market got established in 95. They become very famous. On a very hot day when the system demand was very high, they realized it's better to shut down the factory, let everybody go home and sell that electricity back to the grid. Yeah, it's a
Um,
corporation play, of course.
Here in British Columbia, the electricity management system is tied in through SCADA connections to pulp and paper mill boilers. When they need 5 or 10 megawatts, they just turn off big demand things. Now, the other side of it, though, you said something very important. What do the utilities do? Utilities remain necessary. It's possible for a hobbyist to be off grid,
Hmm.
but they have to really want to, and they have to invest a lot of time, money, and get inferior results because you can't run a microgrid equivalent to Denmark or Copenhagen. When you're having a heart attack, you want everything to work. So you're always going to have a wire, and you're always going to be net metering makes a lot of stuff viable for rooftop solar. That means you're going to be depending upon the grid for ancillary services. Most small home solar panels, inverters, and batteries aren't grid forming. They don't create frequency. They just match the frequency of the grid that's coming through the side. Most home solar systems are designed to shut down if grid electricity is interrupted. So what's happened is we depend upon the grid for frequency, for backup power, for taking excess power from our solar panels, for quality of electricity. How many people actually use surge protectors anymore because the grid doesn't surge? You might be right. But let's just take my building, 233 units, 19-story tower, and a podium with a bunch more units. And there ain't nearly enough rooftop to power the building. We still need the grid. And once again, 90% of people live in circumstances like that. There's schools and factories which have higher draws than they can meet mostly with the solar they might be able to put on roof. And you've got the high demand areas like industrial laundries for hotels and hospitals consume a lot of energy and can't run that. They need the grid. Transit needs the grid. Subways and trolleys, even single residentials need the grid. But how do you structure that out to be cost-effective utilities? Because they get paid almost entirely from the units of electricity they sell. That's the way regulations are structured. But they're providing all these other services for free that aren't costed. The wires and those services have value and must be maintained. We need to design the utility regulation to permit a sufficient amount of revenue for utilities that they can maintain that distribution network, even in the case where you're doing that. And some of that is virtual power plants. When people put solar on their roof, it's owned by the utility and they get electricity as a service. When they put a battery in, it's owned by the utility and they get a service. So we have to do some innovation around utility business models, but utilities are absolutely essential and no one's going to go it alone. I've spoken to some people who managed off-grid and they made some serious compromises and they did it because it would have cost them 30 grand to get a wire strung from the road, the one to put the house, hundreds of meters into the property they inherited. Unique outlier condition.
There will be, of course, a rated battery in the distribution system, like in your case, could be a 5 or 10 megawatt hour battery to take all the fluctuations out. The demand becomes flatter, the load factor becomes much higher because the peak of peak is a designation. It's a thinking that every kilowatt hour I have to chuck it some extra coal or oil. But if that goes away, then peak and off peak is just our inability to store. If we can store cheaply, then it's a flat load. So everything is a base load, right?
And that is where the vehicles shine because in the duck curve or at night, vehicle charging is at its highest. I've been looking at thermal storage recently. A lot of European buildings come with built-in thermal storage. Quite amazing.
I think we need to have a long conversation. You are so knowledgeable. I'm really amazed the knowledge that you bring to the table. Is there anything else I could have asked you?
The thing that you said you wanted to talk to me was hydrogen versus electric trucks. We did touch on that. But I will say that I was engaged with a study out of Sweden's RISE Institute over the end of last year. Jacob Bergstadius was the lead researcher. It asked me to participate in the advisory board. So we had David Sabon, founder and head of the Center for Sustainable Road Freight at Cambridge, and the head of hydrogen for Daimler was also on the call. I was on the advisory, which is occasionally snippy because Daimler believes that hydrogen for trucking is a thing, and well, it's not going to be. So in that narrative bubble. But what Jacob did was do simulation of a 2035 Europe for all road transportation with every potential power source. And what the study found when we made sure the assumptions were right, not have these fictitious lowball costs for hydrogen, was that hydrogen had no economic place as we consider the cost of electricity, the declining cost of batteries, and the technological evolution in that space. 2035, hydrogen won't pencil out. And that's going to be true everywhere. There's people who are in denial about it.
I hope the penny has dropped, and for the rest, it will drop soon. Cannot keep on dreaming while the world is changing. Thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Well, hell, thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Energypreneurs. To continue listening to this conversation, please visit us at Energypreneurs. Thank you. See you next time.